First of all, I want to commend the Macdonald Laurier Institute for their fantastic work. They have been relentless in doing good work in defense of democracy and human rights, and of course so many other issues that they deal with. But I also want to thank from the bottom of my heart our panelists that are here today, because at the end of the day, they're the inspiration for freedom and democracy. And I'm particularly happy today because I had the privilege of meeting a legend in many ways, Rosa Maria Payá. We all know what you're all about. And I can tell you, as a Montrealer, the connection to your dad in Montreal goes way back, of course, because Mr. Payá was a defender of human rights when it wasn't even in style, when it was hard to do it. And he broke that ceiling, and he had the courage at a time when most did not have the courage. Michael Lima is a hero for me. Like I said, he inspires me. He's one of those Canadians that has worked relentlessly to knock the doors and the corridors of Parliament Hill and to shake the cages and to call for action. I have my fellow Montrealer on this panel, Senator Teich, who's also an inspiration for me, a human rights lawyer who always stands up for what is right around the world. And like I said, I visited Cuba many, many years ago, a beautiful country, one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited. But what I saw there compelled me to start speaking out against that regime. And I've made a promise to myself I won't go back until that country is free and the people of Cuba decide for themselves the future. They have that right, as every human being has that right. We live right now in precarious times. More than ever, democracy is challenged around the world. We see the aggressiveness and how emboldened China has been, of course, in trampling independence and freedom in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. Their belligerent approach to dealing with Taiwan and other neighbors. We've seen now, of course, Russian and the boot of Putin on the throats of the people of Ukraine. And for whatever reason, democracies around the world, instead of rising to this new call and this new threat of evil, we seem to become more compliant and complacent. We need to get the message out to Canadians that when you go to Cuba, when you encourage the economy there, you go there and you benefit from the beauty of that country. But the only people that benefit from your investment are dictators, a totalitarian regime that use the profits of that money to keep their boot to the throat of the Cuban peoples and continue the fight, liberty and freedom for the Cuban people. Patria y vida forever. God bless you.
Canadian people, and I do believe that the Canadian people is a generous people. I do believe that if the Canadian people get to know what is going on in Cuba, not from one hotel to the other, but what is going on the real Cuba, what is going on among our population, what are the sufferings of our people, I'm sure that they will be not only compassionate, but solidarious and ready to act. July 11 last year was a surprise for the world, not for us, the moment in which hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the streets demanding freedom, demanding the end of the dictatorship, chanting Patria y vida, homeland and life, which is, by the way, not by coincidence, is very similar to what the people of Iran is chanting in the streets. They are chanting woman, freedom, and life. It was also very personal and very moving for me to see the Cuban people in the streets making this sign. This sign, which initially meant liberation, Liberación, that was the name of the movement that my father and many others founded in the 80s, has now become the symbol of liberty for the Cuban people. But you know what? Not only for the Cuban people, Venezuelans are also standing their hands like that, asking for libertad, for liberación, for our people. And that's not a coincidence. That's not just mimic what is going on in one place or the others. We are totally convinced, because we have been living through it, because we have been suffering it, that the Cuban regime, in a sentence, the Cuban regime is the Berlin Wall of our hemisphere. It's thanks to the Cuban regime that we have to deal now with the Venezuelan dictatorship, that we have to deal with the Nicaraguan dictatorship. The second one, and I think this one is very specific, and it's thanks to the work of Sarah and Michael, We just presented a petition for Magnitsky sanctions against the criminals in power in Cuba. 12 Cuban entities and officials that should be sanctioned in every democracy, and Canada should be leading that process. Please support that. Please.
With more than 1,000 political prisoners, Cuba is the leading jailer of political prisoners in the Americas. Today, levels of repression are the highest in 2 decades, according to an Amnesty International report from 2021. In the face of systemic violence, the people of Cuba live in a state of defenselessness, deprived of an independent judicial system or independent media. Despite repression, there have been thousands of protests taking place in the island since September 2020, signaling the reverse of a culture of protest in the island. All of this development demand international solidarity. The new global context is imperative for Canada to leave behind concepts of a foreign policy towards Cuba designed to assert real or imaginary national identity in the international arena. While it's legitimate that every country asserts autonomy in the formulation of its foreign policy, in the 21st century, being a good global citizen as a nation involves acting together with other democratic nations to stop the advance of authoritarianism in Cuba and everywhere around the world. In view of the levels of persecutions, the reports of tortures, and the total impunity enjoyed by the Cuban Ministry of the Interior, which is legally protected in Cuba from the worst human rights violations, Canada should invoke the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, or Sergei Magnitsky Law, which we and the Pan American Foundation and Sarah Teich are advocating, on high officials in Cuba responsible for atrocity crimes, as it has been done in 21 countries, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, Belarus. Targeted sanctions are a precise instrument that human rights advocates and lawyers use as a means of combating human rights violations. Alliances between Cuba, China, and Iran help reveal the implications of forging a global culture of impunity amid atrocity crimes. While the Iranian regime condemned the July 11, 2021 protests in Cuba as motivated by the United States, the Cuban regime responded reciprocally by calling the protests that have taken place in Iran after the death of Masha Amini, brutally beaten by the morality police, as vandalic acts promoted from abroad. Similarly, China helps the Cuban regime stay afloat with a technology to censor websites, social media, and to cut off access to activists, reducing spaces to coordinate actions and mobilize for democratic change. Canada's foreign policy towards Cuba must be consistent with Canadian values that stand in support of justice, democracy, human rights in Canada and around the world. As Wilfrid Laurier, Canada's 7th Prime Minister and proponent of individual liberty and limited government, said, "Canada is free and freedom is its nationality." Applying these values in a principled manner means taking action in response to authoritarianism and human rights abuses in Cuba.
Yesterday, we submitted a submission to Global Affairs, and we asked them to impose targeted sanctions on 10 Cuban officials and 2 Cuban entities with responsibility for gross human rights violations and the crackdown of the July 2021 protests. Essentially, these officials and entities cracked down so hard on the protesters that it has been condemned around the world, including uncharacteristically by the Canadian government itself. So Trudeau condemned the crackdown, as did the Foreign Affairs Ministry. In spite of that, the Canadian government has not actually followed up with meaningful action. Another feature of this is that with the new amendments to Magnitsky Act and to special economic measures, any assets that are seized from sanctioned officials can actually be sold and the proceeds repurposed to compensate victims. Because the Cuban people deserve reparations. They deserve justice for the crimes that have happened. Some other initiatives that we can pursue and we plan to pursue at a later date are looking at international courts and tribunals. So the International Criminal Court can look at atrocity crimes committed on the territories of states parties. Cuba is not a state party to the ICC, but there are many countries that are where Cuban officials are operating.